Hi.
The sound of his car pulling into the driveway sent a ripple through my chest. I wasn't supposed to feel this way, but there I was, standing in the kitchen, gripping a wooden spoon a little too tightly, waiting. The summer had started like any other, an escape, a favor, a chance to help my daughter while she worked long hours. But now, standing in her home, the weight of something unspoken pressed down on me. I had spent the afternoon making dinner, a habit that gave me purpose, something to focus on. The scent of garlic and rosemary filled the house, but it wasn't enough to drown out my own thoughts. Then the front door opened. His voice, steady, familiar, greeted me, and I turned, smiling like nothing was out of place. He walked into the kitchen, setting down his bag. "Smells amazing," he said, glancing toward the stove. "It's your favorite," I replied without thinking. He paused. His expression flickered for just a second, but I caught it. "You mean her favorite," he corrected, and suddenly the room felt too small. I forced a laugh, brushing it off. "Same thing, isn't it?" But even I could hear the way my voice shifted. The line I shouldn't cross had been drawn long ago, and yet I kept getting closer. That night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence between us was louder than the soft clinking of silverware. I could see it in the way he avoided my gaze, in the tension in his shoulders, and maybe, just maybe, he could see it in me too. Reflection. Looking back, I know now that small moments like this were where it all began. Not with some grand revelation, but with quiet hesitations, glances held just a second too long. It's easy to tell yourself that nothing is happening, until it is. I told myself it was harmless. A glance, a fleeting thought, a quiet moment between two people who had nothing but time and proximity. But as the days passed, those moments grew sharper, charged with something I refused to name. I began to notice the little things, how he rolled up his sleeves when washing the dishes, the way his brow furrowed when he focused on his work. I told myself it was simple observation, nothing more. One evening, after my daughter left for a work event, we found ourselves alone again. The house felt different without her, quieter, heavier. I poured 2 glasses of wine, offering him one without a word. He hesitated before taking it, his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. We sat on the couch, the hum of the television playing in the background, though neither of us was paying attention. I made a comment about the stress he must be under, about how much he carried on his shoulders. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, and I saw it then, the exhaustion, the weight of expectation pressing down on him. I reached out, barely thinking, my hand resting on his arm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at me, really looked at me. The kind of look that lingers, that asks a question neither of us was ready to answer. I pulled my hand back, forcing a smile, forcing normalcy. "You should get some rest," I said lightly. He nodded, but as he stood, I saw it in his eyes. He knew as well as I did. We had stepped too close to something we couldn't take back. The heat of the summer pressed against the windows, the kind that made the air thick and slow. I spent the afternoon by the pool, the sun warming my skin as I let my mind drift. From my spot, I could see him inside, working at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the screen, jaw set in concentration. I told myself I wasn't watching him, just observing the world around me. But when he finally looked up and met my gaze through the window, I knew that was a lie. I waved him over, a casual gesture, an invitation without weight. He hesitated, then closed his laptop and stepped outside, stretching as he walked toward me. "You should take a break," I said, tilting my head up to meet his gaze. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've got too much to do," he replied, but he sat anyway. The silence between us was familiar now, an unspoken thing that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. I reached out, my fingers grazing his shoulder. "You seem tense," I said. "Let me help." His body stiffened for a second, then eased as I pressed my fingers against his shoulders. It was nothing, just a simple gesture, but I felt the shift. The way his breathing slowed, the way his head tilted slightly forward. My hands moved instinctively, reading the knots of tension in his muscles. Then, as if realizing something too late, he pulled away. "I should get back to work," he said, his voice tight. I nodded, watching as he walked inside. I should have felt embarrassed, but all I felt was anticipation. The distance between us was shrinking, and neither of us seemed willing to stop it. The night was warm, the kind that made everything feel heavier. The house was quiet, just the two of us. My daughter wouldn't be back until the next evening, and though I told myself it didn't matter, I knew it did. I found him in the living room, a book open in his lap, though he wasn't reading. His eyes lifted to mine as I entered. I hesitated, then sat beside him, closer than I should have. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my voice light. He sighed, closing the book. "Yeah." I could feel the weight in his voice, something unspoken pressing against the silence. The air between us felt different now, like a balance had shifted in a way neither of us were ready to acknowledge. I reached for the glass of wine I had brought with me, taking a slow sip before offering it to him. He took it, his fingers brushing against mine, and for just a second, neither of us let go. Then reality settled in. He leaned back, clearing his throat, as if trying to shake off whatever had passed between us. "I should get some sleep," he said, his voice quieter than before. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, me too." He stood, hesitating for just a second before walking away. I sat there, staring at the empty space he left behind, knowing something had shifted, but also knowing it would never go any further than this. The days that followed were different. We spoke less, careful with our words, measured in our movements. He avoided eye contact, and I let him, though we both knew that pretending wouldn't erase what had happened. I should have felt guilty. Maybe I did. But beneath that, beneath the logical part of my brain screaming at me to walk away, was something else. A curiosity, a question left unanswered. That evening, as I packed my things to leave earlier than planned, the weight of it all settled on my chest. My daughter wasn't home yet, and he was in the kitchen, pretending to be busy. I stood at the doorway watching him, waiting for him to look up. He didn't. "I'm heading out in the morning," I finally said, my voice quieter than I expected. He stilled for half a second, then turned, leaning against the counter. "Didn't you say you'd stay until the end of the month?" I shrugged. "Plans change." The air between us was thick with everything we weren't saying. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "That's probably for the best." I smiled, though it didn't reach my eyes. "Probably." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I stepped forward, closing the distance between us just enough that he had to make a choice, to stay or to step back. His eyes searched mine, looking for something, maybe permission, maybe an answer. I didn't give him one. He took a slow breath, then did what I knew he would. He stepped away. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head as I turned to leave. My fingers grazed the doorframe, lingering for just a moment before I spoke again. "Take care of her," I said. His voice was low, almost strained. "You know I will." I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything else, and just like that, it was over before it ever really began. But as I walked away, I felt it. The quiet thrill, the sharp ache of something almost real. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the best stories are the ones that never fully unfold.
Bye.